In this section of the training, I want to focus on the negative connotations of risk, reflecting on the concept of fear, of the impact of living and working within a blame culture, of erring on the side of caution that leads us to potentially become more risk averse in our decision making. I'm sure you're very familiar with this phrase, glass half full, glass half empty. Well, it's something that's very pertinent to thinking about risk and working with risk. So let's take that first phrase, working with risk. It was the name of a publication that I wrote many years back, but it's a phrase that I prefer to use day in and day out because, as a phrase, it says, or it does what it says on the tin. As you see there, it's what we do every day, it's what influences and affects every decision we make. We're constantly working with risk. But now just take that one word alone, risk. How is that most often defined? Well, if you look at dictionary definitions, they will tend to focus much more on the negative. So you'll see phrases like loss and danger and harm. But I would argue that if we're going to engage people in conversations to help us to reflect on risk and how we think of and work with risk, then in order to engage people, we need to see more than just the negative side of that phrase. We need to be thinking, what are the positive elements of risk that we can engage as well, that will help us to build that fuller picture, that will help to trigger those conversations between people. But as I said earlier, this particular beginning of the whole presentation is going to focus very much from fear around blame, around what we might call risk aversion. And I'm going to suggest to you that even if you are bound by fear in some way, bound by the fear of being blamed, if something goes wrong, and if that causes you to feel a little bit more risk averse in your decisions, there are still no guarantees that this is the safest and most secure way forward. The final statement on this particular slide is one I'll keep coming back to. There is no such thing as a risk-free option. So I want you to be thinking first and foremost about your response to thoughts about fear, thoughts about the blame culture, thoughts about risk aversion, and how they play out for you in your life, in your work. Which then takes us on to this next important question. What does risk actually mean to you? I've set up something here that I'll call a risk tolerance scale. And you'll see over on the left, there's a group of people pretty much with their heads in the sand. So I have to ask, is this the way of trying to avoid making those difficult decisions? This seems to be more of a risk-averse way of approaching something, whereas if we look to the right of the slide, you'll see the person on the surfboard surfing the big wave, and I'm sure you'll agree this is more of a risk-taking picture. Where are you on that risk tolerance scale? I would suggest, when I think and I reflect, and I'm sure you do the same to a certain extent, that we would like to see ourselves more to the right side of the picture than the left. But my important message to you is we should never think of ourselves as being just fixed in one position across that continuum. It's much more important that we should be thinking decision by decision. Different decisions we make, different circumstances that we find ourselves in, different levels of information, different ways of collaborating with people. All of these will put us in different positions on that overall continuum. And that's a much more important and nuanced way to think. Different decisions can be located in different points across that wide spectrum from left to right. Let me also suggest that even the same decision might be located in different positions as new information comes to light, as we find ourselves in slightly different circumstances. So it's not a rigid either or choice, it's not fixed. It's about thinking about risk in a more fluid way. But staying with the idea of fear and blame, and I'll come back in a moment to the book that's mentioned there, Gardner's book on the politics of fear. I'll pick up on some of the main messages that he puts across. But before I do, just think more broadly. A culture of fear, culture of blame is one that's quite often generating stigma about particular people, about particular behaviours, about particular types of risk. And will generate a lot more of a negative thought, a negative feeling, a negative response in this cultural sense. And I'll ask you to reflect for a moment or two on times that you've been particularly aware of these issues, maybe when you've been a victim of a sense of stigma. You've been on that receiving end of very negative responses from others. Then there's this issue about evidence. We'll often hear the phrase or the question, where's the evidence for what you're suggesting? Where's the evidence to show that it works? Well, with risk, we have a slight problem. There's an evidence base out there, but I'm going to suggest it's very narrow. It's an evidence base that is based in failure. We're very good at recording when things go wrong. We can build up a whole range of evidence around events that went wrong. However, we're not so good at providing the evidence about things that work, what goes right, what helped it to go right. We're just not hardwired to think in those terms. So when you're being invited to provide the evidence, just spend a moment thinking about that evidence base. When you're thinking about risk, I have to say that evidence base is very skewed. It's very narrow. So we need to treat it with a large degree of caution. That's not to say that it's not accurate about some elements of what goes on, but we can't treat that evidence base as being relevant to the whole spectrum of risk. Then I'll ask you to just think briefly about personal responses, maybe yours, maybe society's reactions when mistakes happen. And I'm talking here about when big mistakes happen. There's a common theme that emerges, and you'll see this in some of the big news items that appear from time to time, where there's a sense that when a mistake has happened, the initial reaction is for people to go into denial. It wasn't me. No. Cover their backs to a certain extent. Institutions, again, they'll do the similar thing, pulling up the drawbridge, covering their backs, issuing denials, maybe on occasions even going as far as telling lies, creating different stories as to what happened and what didn't happen. It's that natural defense mechanism. We're defending ourselves against this fear. This fear that blame is going to have severe consequences for us. We talk about learning the lessons, but we're not really able to feel that open to admit mistakes in order that learning can really happen. Do you really feel that you're going to be understood and supported through that learning the lessons process? Well, what this means is, by and large, we're promoting a fear of failure over and above a focus on a potential to succeed. We're asking people, or we're putting people into positions where decisions are being made by and large from this position of fear and the chance that we will fail, rather than from a position where we're thinking about striving forward and really going for it. What we end up with is something along the lines of this image. It's his fault, it's her fault, it's their fault, but it's not me. Well, let's try and step back from that. I said I'd come back to Dan Gardner. Here's the reference for the book that I mentioned earlier. He was, probably still is, a journalist living and working in Ottawa in Canada when I came across this particular book. I just want to share some of the thoughts and ideas that emerged. I'm not going to make any apologies for focusing very much on this one book because this presentation is about developing a risk mindset. It's not about reviewing all of the risk literature. Dan starts off in the book by reminding us of the situation back on 9/11 2001. It's New York City, and just under 3,000 people were killed as those planes were flown into the Twin Towers. A lesser known statistic is that for the 12 months following on from that event, 1,595 people died on the US roads above what would have been seen as the annual average. What we've got is a situation where fear shifted people en masse out of planes, into cars, onto roads. And whilst we can say fairly clearly what the average number of deaths on the roads across the United States would have been, because we have those statistics year on year, for that one particular year, it turned out to be 1,595 higher than would have been expected. And they know that they can be specific with that statistic because travel patterns pretty much returned to normal about 12 months later. So by the latter part of 2002 onwards, the use of planes, the use of cars, pretty much across the US had returned to comparable levels to the pre-9/11 events. What this is saying is that we need to be aware of the consequences of our decisions, particularly those decisions that are driven by fear. I'm going to come back to that phrase I mentioned earlier. There is no such thing as a risk-free option. But Dan, in his book, also suggests that fear can be constructive. When we worry about risk, we think more about it, and as a result, we focus on it, we keep it alive. We can certainly thrive as a result of working together with a focus on thinking about the risks and the potential impacts of the risks. But fear results when we move to the other extreme. And at that point, this whole process and way of thinking becomes much more unreasonable and unreasoning in terms of the level of fear that we take on. That's a whole another matter altogether. Within this book, he also goes on to suggest that we worry more than previous generations. You've just got to open a newspaper, you've just got to look at TV news or listen to the news on the radio. Then in this modern day, we're looking at the advance of smartphones, laptops, access constantly through social media to news feeds. There'll be a cause for fear being highlighted on a daily basis. Within the book, he also reflects on the thinking of Ulrich Beck, who presents a different perspective, that actually we are at more risk than ever before. And Ulrich Beck focuses very much on the angle about technology and how it's outstripping our ability to control it. Just looking at the development of mobile phones, of laptops, all of the technology at our fingertips, the advances in robotics, concerns around issues of climate change. All of these things really do seem to be running rampant in some way. Can we really keep a hold of the advances and the magnitude of some of the fears that they generate? But having said that, we've also got to take into account that what we consider to be the developed world, life expectancy is constantly increasing, infant mortality is decreasing, and on most measures, we're living better quality lives now than at any time. We're more prosperous than at any other time in the history of the planet. That's even taking account of the impact of a global pandemic over a lengthy period of time. But again, I'm kind of jumping around different thoughts that emerge from Dan's particular book. He illustrates, again, the contradictions. If we think about the whole issue of evidence, we make a lot of assumptions that contradict what the real evidence is telling us. This is echoed in the previous message around road traffic accidents following 9/11, but He uses a number of case studies around smoking, around people who go on marches looking to ban genetically modified foods, despite there being no particular evidence that they cause harm. He looks at murders that grab the headlines, whereas the total carnage on the roads doesn't. He looks in detail about how reports in 24/7 media are influencing our thinking, perhaps much more than an analysis of the real evidence. And just looking at our approach, how we become more overprotective of children, that's an example that's highlighted as well. Certainly, if I contrast my childhood and the freedom I experienced with the concerns one generation on, when I look at my children and how we become possibly overprotective of children in the face of what the real numbers are telling us. He reminds us that we're 26 times more likely to be killed in a car than abducted by a stranger, which again will challenge the presentation of messages in the media. And perhaps a very important one is that the evidence indicates that we have never had it so good as now as a society. And that's an important message, but our hardwiring of our brains was shaped by environments that bear little resemblance to the world that we inhabit now. So we might struggle to take that message on. What he means by let's say, the evolution of our brains is if we think that we're now trying to deal with a computer age, a digital age, yet our brains were originally devised at a time when the most complex decision that had to be made was the picking of berries in a field. Which were the safe ones, which were not the safe ones. So, as a conclusion, Dan Gardner does suggest that the wonder is not that we sometimes make mistakes about risk. The wonder really is that we get it right most of the time, or even some of the time. That's the real wonder. Let's stay on this theme about the blame culture. What are the potential outcomes? What are the consequences of this way of thinking? Here's two that I'm going to offer to you. Firstly, that a society that needs to perpetuate a culture of blame only serves to destroy the seeds of confidence before they have an opportunity to flourish. That's something I wrote in an article many years back, but it's an important one. It's an important message when we're thinking about our risk mindset. A consequence of this negative risk mindset is that danger is that we're constantly stoking up fear. People become more concerned about being blamed and getting things, or more concerned about being blamed than they are about getting things right. And the consequence of that is quite possibly that creativity, innovation, things that we're lauding as the way forward, that these kind of advancements are actually being held back to a certain degree. Then, at an individual level, particularly from my experience in health and social care, the quashing of personal aspirations can only serve to contribute to the potential for serious risks and damaging consequences. What I mean by that is that we're focused on a person in terms of their pathology, their diagnosis, all about their negative experiences of a condition. And as a result, we're not listening to their agenda when they're trying to express their wishes. We actually give them very good cause to disengage from us, not see us as being relevant to them. And whilst I'm saying that comes from a health and social care perspective, whatever field that you're working in, I'm going to suggest that those messages are still very pertinent to you in terms of the decision making that you're involved in. So it's important to think about how you're managing the people in your business, in your work, how you're managing your connections with your clients, the people you serve. that it's very important that we should be aware of what their aspirations are, what their wishes are, what their agenda is, and be thinking about how do I work with that? How do I best serve them? If we're focused on the blame culture, this young woman really does illustrate the situation. How is she going to feel able or enabled to consider taking risks if she's working in a team or within a culture where everybody is so quick to point the finger of blame? You almost see the cogs turning. She's got the ideas, but she's held back by all these negative influences around her. So we need to be thinking about shifting that risk agenda. And there's a number of ways that we can begin to think about that shift. Firstly, good identification of the risks that we're working with. And that can be boosted or improved by collaboration amongst people, not by generating more of the I'm going to blame them, it's her fault, it's his fault, it's their fault. And how do we collaborate more? How do we draw people in to share information? How do we reflect on the information that we've got and reflect together on that information to help build up the fuller picture? These are all important questions that we've constantly got to be asking ourselves. We need to create a counterbalance to the negativity of risk. And I'll certainly be developing that throughout this and the modules across this training. We essentially need to integrate a whole appreciation of strengths, look at how strengths fit in with our way of working with risk. Module 4 in particular will focus very much on the details of working with strengths. So this is about you as a person in terms of the work that you do. What strengths do you have? What strengths have you built up through your work, through your connections? What strengths do you see in your employees or your colleagues? What strengths do you see in your customers, your clients, your patients? So if you're working with health and social care, how do we focus on the individual who is clearly in contact with us because of problems and the experiences of a particular diagnosis or a set of social circumstances? But then how do we ensure that we're focused on them by also looking at their capabilities, their strengths, their abilities? So this is a means of trying to draw in constructive, positive information that we can blend in with that negativity of risk that I've set out earlier in this particular talk, so that we can, as a result, move forward in different ways through our risk mindset and our ways of working with risk. So it's about shifting that mindset. And here's a quote to help us reflect on that shift in the agenda. The source is unknown. I think it's a Romanian philosopher, but I've tried Googling it and I can't find the actual source. But it's an important message. If it wasn't for the possibility of suicide, I would have killed myself a long time ago. Now that's a very powerful statement, and instantly that word suicide will leap out to people. But for those of you not involved in health and social care, I want to suggest that within that particular quote, suicide is not the important word that I want to focus on here in the context of this presentation. What I want to focus on is that word possibility. Looking at that message, if it wasn't for having the choice, then I would have been backed into a corner. My choices clearly would have been limited. And then who knows? The message there is I would have killed myself a long time ago. So it's about possibilities. That's what we need to think about when we're expanding our mindset about risk. Scary image, yeah? Is this a person, in relation to that quote that I just mentioned to you, is this a person who's about to jump? Or is this a person very comfortable surveying all the domain around them, all they have access to, all that they may have power over? What I'm suggesting here is there can be very different perspectives on a limited piece of information, such as an image or a few words. What they convey to us, depending on our risk mindset, we could be thinking very, very differently. So it's about opening up our mindset and having a more dynamic, fluid mindset in relation to risk. So it's about these different visions that we might have of risk. Again, if you think back to that quote that I mentioned just a moment back, how you respond personally to the suicide quote will reflect on the principles and the visions that you subscribe to in working with risk. So when you saw the quote, if it wasn't for the possibility of suicide, I would have killed myself a long time ago. If you're taking a policy approach, depending on the nature of the work, the position that you're in, you might well instantly be looking at that and thinking, how do we develop the information to set targets so we can manage the numbers and minimize the number of times that people do commit suicide? If you're coming from an academic perspective, looking at evidence, the evidence-based approach might be, how do we access more information to be able to identify the specific risk factors that will suggest whether a person is going to commit suicide or not? And in terms of a clinical theme, we're faced with this vision or this challenge of, how do we manage the situation? Do we get in there and take control for the person? Or do we enable people by getting alongside them, helping them to express themselves more, gain more information from them, which links in with the last point on this slide, this ethical vision of being focused on a personal narrative, getting the person to tell their story, supporting a person to have choice, particularly around decisions that they want to make. So are we really there on their side? All of these are different ways of looking at perhaps the same piece of information. So I'm talking about shifting the agenda, but I just want to stay briefly with this idea of the politics of fear. Where's that coming from? What is it that's holding us in this particular mindset or frame of mind? Well, I'm going to suggest initially it's about the media, the way the media reports risks and mistakes, particularly when it's generated as being in the public interest to know who made the mistake and then be seen to hold them accountable. That's a very powerful message. We're talking about big errors by and large, but there is this underlying thought that somebody needs to be hung out to dry for something that's gone wrong. The problem here is, again, back to that evidence base, we're talking by and large about very rare, very extreme events. And the reality of our day-to-day risk, you in whatever area of work that you're involved in, is that you'll be working with a whole range of different people. And you'll be thinking about your own life and the reality of the day-to-day risks that you're working with. And in doing that, there's always the danger that everything becomes totally distorted when the evidence is only, and the reporting has only been on very extreme and rare events. The two things, these rare events and our day-to-day experiences, are miles apart. What we've created over the years by shifting in this direction is that we've allowed bureaucratic reactions to take over. And we create a drive for administrative solutions to particular problems and to the risks that emerge. We're trying almost to remove the person and their experience out of it. We're suggesting that we can manage it, or we believe we can manage it better if we impose some specific bureaucratic means or administrative processes on the situation. What this means actually is that not completing the risk assessment may in fact be the greatest risk for many practitioners or anyone else involved in making a big decision. If it goes wrong, the message coming back is, if you didn't complete a risk assessment, you were in the wrong. So that becomes our greatest risk. And a further consequence of this approach is that it becomes easy to lose sight of who we're really serving. You as a practitioner might lose sight of the individual person when you focus more on the processes that are demanded by the bureaucracy. You as, let's say, a business owner might lose sight of your clients when your focus is much more on the processes, the procedures that you've set up and are trying to adhere to. This can become the outcome of the politics of fear. This is the outcome of a blame culture. Here we have a young woman who, I'm going to say, undoubtedly would have been very creative and a very innovative person. But what we see from this image is files of policies, attempts at filling in all these administrative procedures, takes its toll. It becomes exhausting. The toll that's taken on the individual, the person can no longer flourish. You end up exhausted by the weight of the administration. So I want you to reflect back. If you take a break at this point, reflect back on those messages about the politics of fear, the blame culture. How does that work for you? In what ways have you experienced that in your work? And reflect on the influence, the influences, being honest to yourself, the influence that it might have had on you and your way of thinking. You'll see attached to this presentation that there is a PDF document, The Challenging Concept of Risk. Have a read of that alongside the messages emerging here. You'll see on the final page that there's room for notes. So I will encourage you to use that to make your own notes about your reflections from this presentation and some of your reflections from reading that particular document. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy. We've started off with that negative sense at the beginning of this module, but it will transfer across. By the end of the module, we'll be focusing very much on that concept of positive risk taking.